I would like to welcome everybody. I would prefer to do it personally, person by person, but there's some at least in the room who really deserve it for very special reasons, because they joined the center some days, weeks ago. And please let me announce the presence of Validity. I have always difficulties to pronounce your second name, and we have today a kind of a small group that has really will be a challenge for our pronunciation capabilities. Your topic is, if you allow, to present her in this small round, a small circle, who is nearly an inner circle today, in a way, the weather. That everybody has come, though this weather is so seducing, and I will seduce myself, and I want to make a compliment to myself to be here, if you allow also. So, her topic is Roots of Economic Ethics in the Early Modern Period, Gift Exchange, and there we have a lot of associations, practices, shared judicial values, and symbolic inventions. You will tell exactly what you are doing about this topic, because we are in the phase now of relating the economic sphere to the law, beyond the law and economics debate that is very familiar to most of us. There is a second new fellow center. It is Valentino Catalan, who is not from Catalonia, or perhaps with long roots, but in the surroundings of Venice, and for the rest, a cosmopolitan life and CV. We will talk later, we will have occasions to talk with you. Several occasions, but I would like at least to mention that his topic, from the island of stone money to the archipelago of Islamic finance, reading Mangan's limits to growth as an exploration into law, economy, and cultures. This is not only a long title, but it's also a big program, a very fascinating program. So we'll have the chance to communicate about it. Very welcome at the center as well. And Dr. Raphael Modrzynski, goes in the right direction.
More or less.
Modrzynski. Okay, thank you. Who will work at our center about the legal system of the doing law and making a living in nascent market economies, socio-economic transformation, changing legal systems and professional orientations of lawyers in Poland and Russia. So, of course, the undertones go in the direction of corruption, sceneries, systems, etc. Perhaps, maybe, but this is important. I know that you're studying this kind of field, and there will be a lot of interest in our circle to discuss with you about your special field that might have a lot of further implications, interesting for all of us. So, this means that now we can go to the presentation of Jan Suntrup and his topic. And you have seen state of exception. Why is such a topic interesting for the Center for Advanced Study Law as culture? What kind of culture is implied when speaking about this very special figure that has become more and more a normality? Do you remember that the critique of the some European states towards Turkey was not in the least meaning and intention signed by Macron and the French Republic? In what kind of state are they at the moment? There is a state of exception criticizing another state of exception. rather interesting. More and more having become a kind of normal reality. What is this kind of figure? Of course, we know the debates around Carl Schmitt and the role, the pathos of exception has in his writings, and what still may be transmitted to some of the readers of today. I tried some years ago, in the context of a conference about the normative complex, to define validity culture that is centered and focused on this state of exception as a specific type of making any kind of action valid, even in a legal sense, because the non-legality of actions is implied in overriding legal structure as such, and where the institution becomes one of decision-making as such, and the ritual vitalism of the real life is standing against this other kind of everyday life, who is and which is something very different from that, and has not the same attraction. The idea of the Ausnahmezustand in Schmidt's writings has had and still has a lot of attraction for people who also may think that the problem of understanding revolution in legal terms has always to do with that, to go out of normality. And this, for some at least, constitutes a great attraction and make them act in this direction. So, with the title State of Exception, Theoretical Reflections, Legal Structures, Symbolic Forms and Paradigmatic Effects, Jan Christoph Suntrup, who is now a fellow at the Käte Hamburger Center Law and Scholarship, will give insight into the tool of the state of exception, which denotes the precarious and contested boundary between law and politics, and has attracted much media and academic attention in recent years, especially in the course of the fight against terrorism and security policies. This was, of course, the background for the last. But for Algeria in 1955, the rise of the state of exceptionalism in France had a different background, I would say. In his lecture, Jan Suntrup has promised to address central political, theoretical and legal debates on legal models and political implications of the state of exception. So, you might remember that for Giorgio Agamben, the state of exception also plays a central role in the situation of the Homo sacer. He will also particularly discuss the state of exception's paradigmatic effects and subtle tendencies to expand. That's what is really frightening us, some of us at least. A necessary subsequent analysis must then analyze to what extent these can be viewed as a danger to democratic principles and standards of liberal rule of law. This doesn't need any kind of further explanation, but is it really avoidable, and how and in which kind of way are there not sometimes very, very founded reasons to invent and to work with this paradoxical figure to remain in the realm of normativity and of legality, but with the means of legality? So I think this is a very fascinating thing. Such inscriptions of the exception into the normal state of affairs are, for instance, noticeably in the increasingly preventive orientation of penal law, as well as in the European Union's decision-making structures, as you have promised to demonstrate for today. But I think one point that could be even closer to what the kernel and the center of our center's interest, law as culture, is namely to bring in the symbolic and ritual dimension into understanding what the state of exception means, could bring new insights into the figure, the mechanisms, and the way to act in this type of paradoxical, normative, complex situation. So, of course, I have to present Jan Suntrup, who does not need too much presentation because he's well known in the circle, and please allow me to do this in a completely wrong and reduced way. I'm always unhappy when I listen to my own presentation because I want to say, no, this is not right, this was completely different, and we have so many CVs, not only one, and everything depends on the special situation in which we try to do this complex work of presenting the uniqueness of a person and a researcher, but appealing to categorical things and contexts like he studied at and so forth. So if I speak like this, it doesn't mean that I wouldn't see the person behind, who joined us, by the way, some 8 years ago at the center, after a presentation I had made for the Studienstiftung, and he was then just in this student organization and was interested in our topics as a political scientist who has also studied, as you will see, philosophy and economics, starting in Heidelberg, then at the Institut d'études politiques de Lille in France, and then completing his studies in 2007, obtaining a graduate degree with distinction with a comparative thesis on theories of deliberative democracy. So there might be some kind of a historical, biographical interest in the topic of today. The doctorate degree, summa cum laude, in 2010 at the LMU Munich, and then having received the scholarship that I had mentioned before by the Studienstiftung. From 2009 through 2010, young Christoph Suntrup was also employed as a lecturer at the Geschwister-Scholl Institute for Political Science at the University of Munich. Since July 2010, he was employed at our center, as most of us know, and then after having finished and completed his habilitation at the University of Bonn about a grammar, or the idea of a grammar of legal conflicts, not pretentious but ambitious, I would say, very ambitious project that has found really its end and will be published in our series. And then since August 2017 he's a fellow at our center. I would like to also bring into your mind and remind you some of his interesting publications, but I will just restrict it to the two of them. Umkämpftes Recht zur mehrdimensionalen Analyse rechtskultureller Konflikte durch die politische Kulturforschung. So this is the way he changed the title from a grammar to of legal conflicts. And then Formenwandel der französischen Intellektuellen, eine Analyse ihrer gesellschaftlichen Debatten von der Liberation bis zur Gegenwart. So that means that always a look towards France is constitutive for his way to see the world through the lenses of political science, but at the same time, as you will see, not forgetting about the cultural side of politics, and sometimes with a slight and sometimes even stronger sociological undertone. So we listen to your tonality, but also to the content and how you will bring the state of exception closer to our mind and to get a better understanding of that. Very welcome for your talk. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this generous introduction. First of all, I would like to thank the directors of the Käte Hamburger Kolleg, Werner Gebhardt, Nina Dedloff, and Clemens Albrecht for giving me the opportunity of working on my project in such excellent conditions, which have been no surprise to me, of course, as I feel myself entitled to say that after almost 8 years, as you said, at the center, I'm rather familiar with the spirit of this colleague. I'm very glad to be able to present today some results of my research I've already been doing in the last month, and also some ideas for future inquiries to you. As the title of my project suggests, I will try to give you an overview of some of the multiple layers of my topic, the state of exception surprises. Since the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and the infamous war on terror, there's a growing academic discourse on contemporary and historical instances of the state of exception, or state of emergency, or other technical terms, which has become even more animated by recent declarations of the state of exception in France, Turkey, and elsewhere around the world. The frequent applications of this instrument have stimulated legal scholars, philosophers, and political scientists to reflect on the competitive relation between law and politics in exceptional times, different constitutional framings of emergency competencies, and theoretical layouts of the state of exception in the history of political ideas. And this is what I will shortly address at the beginning of this presentation to give you some categorical benchmarks for a better understanding of this rather complex discussion. After that, I will turn soon to two aspects of the state of exception that have been particularly occupying me so far when dealing with this subject. First, Giorgio Agamben's thesis that the state of exception should not be regarded as something exceptional, as you already mentioned in your introduction, but rather structural or paradigmatic. In his work State of Exception, he observed, I quote, "a transformation of a provisional and exceptional measure into a technique of government," a statement that has certainly to be qualified but paved the way for an analysis of structural political effects of the instrument of the state of exception. Other authors have searched in this vein for a characteristic style of emergency politics, which somehow marked the turn from the structure to the practice of emergency. In addition to the supposed change of political style or government technique, other scholars such as Günter Frankenberg have illuminated the danger of an unlimited and continuously extending state of emergency with regard to law, which I will also discuss and would like to discuss with you. Carl Schmitt states in a famous passage of his political theology that the exception was more interesting than the rule, and he continues with the words, "The rule proves nothing, the exception proves everything. It confirms not only the rule but also its existence, which derives only from the exception. In the exception, the power of real life breaks through the crust of a mechanism that has become torpid by repetition." Or in German, "In der Ausnahme durchbricht die Kraft des wirklichen Lebens die Kruste einer in Wiederholung erstarrten Mechanik." This celebration of the exception can not only be found in Schmitt but also in the work of other theoreticians who succumb to the aesthetic appeal of the exception. Schmitt's exposition of the supposed vitalistic and creative force of the exception obviously picks up very classical resentments of law's rigidity and remoteness from everyday life. Just think of the stranger in Plato's Dialogue Politikos, who compared the law to a stubborn and ignorant man. However, Schmitt's fascination with the élan vital of the exception should raise suspicion and suggest scrutinizing the destructive effects of the state of exception, especially with regard to the role of law and democratic principles. And in this regard, looking for instances of a normalization of the exception seems to me not only a task no less interesting in Schmitt's work than dealing with the exception, in contrast to the rule, but a very urgent one if one likes to understand some of the structural, political and legal developments of our times. The second aspect I'm particularly interested in is a subject that has been widely neglected in the far-reaching discourse on the state of exception, and you mentioned it in your introduction, namely its symbolic dimension, and this is why I will speak in the last part of my talk about this phenomenon, the symbolic politics of the state of exception. In the public discussion, the term state of exception is often used in a metaphorical way and for various constellations, so it might be useful to make it clear what the term means in a legal political context, namely the temporary, partial or total suspension of the legal order. Most often not the whole legal order is suspended, but some individual rights and liberties are, and the separation of powers is curtailed with the overriding aim to protect this very legal constitutional order, or more general, socio-political order in general. Hence, the purpose for which this exceptional authority is granted is conservative. The restoration of the state of normality disturbed by military or terrorist attacks, grave political threats such as uprisings and riots, economic crisis or ecological disasters. Such situations are of course not natural or ontological givens that can always be stated and observed objectively, but must be declared as such, so there's a performative speech act involved. Therefore, Schmidt is certainly right when he links the state of exception to a political decision and the voluntarist act to declare the state of exception or emergency. Although his often quoted sentence, the very first of political theology, sovereign is he who decides on the exception, souverän ist, wer über den Ausnahmezustand entscheidet, is not quite as clear as it seems at first glance. I will come back to this in a moment. However, the declaration of the state of exception cannot be reduced to an act of political power or facticity, as the partial or total suspension of the legal order it entails is itself a legal instrument, even though there are some observers who doubt that this intricate constellation can be juridified at all, a position which Agamben resumes as follows: the state of exception appears as the legal form of what cannot have legal form. I cannot decide if Agamben's verdict, according to which the discipline of public law has failed to this day to produce a genuine theory of the state of exception, is justified, but at least one should take note of the fact that roughly 90% of the constitutions worldwide contain explicit emergency provisions. Before showing just a few legal emergency models to you, I would like to present briefly some arguments from the history of political ideas why this tool might be necessary at all. The instrument of special emergency powers begs for justification in all political regimes that claim to be bound by constitutional provisions and the rule of law. This force to justification can, of course, also apply to authoritarian regimes which claim to be ruled by these principles while violating them permanently. In contrast, before the emergence of the modern constitutional state, this conflict between law and politics often did not exist. For the masterminds of absolutist rule, Baudin and Hobbes, there simply was no problem of the exception, as this rule was, aside from few natural law obligations, which did not constitute positive, enforceable rights, legibus solutus. As a consequence, every decision of the sovereign is lawful, as the structural space for exceptions does not exist. John Locke was, as path-breaking liberal constitutionalist, inevitably much more suspicious of sovereign power and its tendencies to expand and to be used for illegitimate purposes, but nevertheless, in the second treatise of government, there is a remarkable plea for the necessity of a prerogative power, which, according to him, is nothing but a power in the hands of the prince to provide for the public good in such cases which, depending upon unforeseen and uncertain occurrences, certain and unalterable laws could not safely direct. Whatsoever shall be done manifestly for the good of the people and the establishing the government upon its true foundation is and always will be just prerogative. The rationality behind this discretionary power is the principle salus populi suprema lex. Although he discusses the danger of a misdirected prerogative, his answer to the question, who shall be judge when this power is made a right use of, is not satisfactory from today's perspective. as the courts are widely neglected entities in Locke's design of political order, there can be, I quote, no judge on earth to decide conflicts between the executive and the legislative branch, as the people have, I quote again, no appeal on earth, but just a liberty to appeal to heaven, which, to be sure, for Locke is no plea for fatalism, given the fact that the people have a natural right to resist against their rulers whom they have entrusted with power. One might add that even the authors of the Federalist Papers, who are probably even more distrustful of the abuse of power than Locke, which made them argue for a sophisticated system of checks and balances, as you know, left room for the legitimate expansion of the executive's competencies in times of existential crisis of the Republic. Another Republican author, Niccolò Machiavelli, is even more instructive in this reflection on the state of exception because he discusses many aspects of its that research in the contemporary debate. In Machiavelli's political theory, the preservation of states, or rather of political order and authority, becomes the first norm. This proto-vision of la raison d'etat implies a ruler not abiding by the letter of the law, but doing what has to be done in a concrete situation, in a legal or illegal, moral or immoral fashion. This legitimation of exceptional powers is backed by a key concept by Machiavelli, necessità. While this concept refers to the historical necessity of events on the one hand, it denotes the empowerment of rulers who are aware of this historically immanent necessity on the other hand. As has been observed by Herfried Münkler and Henning Ottmann, among others, the full meaning of necessità comes to the fore in times of crisis, when necessity exempts the prince from the respect of moral and legal norms to guarantee political stability. This alleged necessity serves not only moral exculpation, but this term has, from an observer's perspective, a special status in public narratives of justification, which are often resorted to. Necessity is the semantic precursor of the multiple Tina discourses that can be witnessed today. There is no alternative, diese Politik ist alternativlos. In his Discorsi, Machiavelli is far less cynical than in Il Principe, who is, as is well known, endowed with every right to deceive and suppress the people. But in contrast to Il Principe, which is an instruction manual for seizing and retaining power, the subject of the Discorsi is the stability of republican orders, for which law and political virtue are as constitutive as mixed government and balance of powers. Machiavelli's advocacy of a law of exception, however, becomes visible when he expresses his appreciation of the ancient Roman institution of dictator, the invention of the legal model of emergency powers in the Roman Republic. In times of crisis, the Roman Senate could commission one or both of the two consuls to appoint a dictator for a period of up to 6 months. During this term of office, the dictator was authorized to suspend rights and legal processes. He could rule by decree, and he was, at least theoretically, not submitted to any political control. This immense conferral of authority was meant to enable a competent and reliable man to restore the political order. After his term, or after the completion of his mission, he was expected to step down, and normal legal and political procedures were resumed. In sum, this model is, according to Carl Schmitt's terminology, a typical case of commissary dictatorship, in opposition to a sovereign dictator who does not restore order but creates a new one, legitimized by history and the claim to embody the people's pouvoir constituant. Just an incidental remark, the Roman case showed that it is not always clear what Schmidt's sentence "sovereign is he who decides" on the exception really means. The Senate declared the state of exception, while the consul attributes exceptional powers to a concrete person. The dictator is not submitted to law and has a huge margin of action, so that he also decides on the exception. So, do we have split or shared sovereignty, or ultimately a sovereignty of law with regard to the constitutional barriers against a permanent dictator? For Schmitt, a constitutional corset is not compatible with real sovereignty. Apart from indicating who is entitled to act in exceptional situations, constitutions may not give further guidance unless the principle of impartible sovereignty is violated, according to him. So, Schmitt's sovereign, I quote, decides whether there is an extreme emergency as well as what must be done to eliminate it. although he stands outside the normally valid legal system, he nevertheless belongs to it, for it is he who must decide whether the constitution needs to be suspended in its entirety." End of quote. This conception has its foundation in Schmidt's broader political theory, which I cannot dwell on today, but coming back to Machiavelli, in his view, without the office of commissary dictator, republics are doomed when very urgent measures are to be taken. I quote, as you see it on the slide, "Because the customary orders in republics have a slow motion, since no council and no magistrate can work anything by itself, but in many things one has need of another, and because it takes time to add these wills together, their remedies are very dangerous when they have to remedy a thing that does not wait for." End of quote. In this context, Machiavelli appears as a kind of constitutional patriot, which admittedly sounds very odd in English, while he concedes that urgent and unforeseen challenges could be answered by a breach of the constitution. He points to the fact that such action could set a precedent, damaging the validity resources of the constitution. Hence, he argues for the constitutional provision and limitation of dictatorship in order to prevent tyranny. However, Machiavelli also makes it clear that constitutional dictatorship can only be successfully resorted to as long as the republican institutions and morals are in good order. In the process of decline comes the time of the uomo virtuoso or ordinatore, an extraordinary, almost superhuman person who alone is capable of saving the republic from its ruin or of becoming the hero of newly established better political order. Thus, Machiavelli's uomo virtuoso is a sort of Schmittian sovereign dictator avant la lettre, I would say. This short excursion was meant to show you some of the most important legitimation patterns and narratives of the state of exception. Hence, arguing for exceptional powers can point to the existence of an existential threat or grave disturbance of the political or social order, community or state, the necessity of certain measures which are without alternative, the insufficiency of the usual provisions and procedures with regard to the urgent measures to take, which demands a concentration of power not or little restricted by legal rules in order to enable efficient action. Furthermore, the models of commissary and sovereign dictatorship have already shown the debate on the scope of emergency models, which are most often conceived as restorative and protective means, and on the legal embedding of exceptional powers. Unlike the Roman Republic, modern constitutions do not provide for the election of a person outside of government to resolve the crisis situation. There are different bases of legitimation. The Roman dictator had to qualify himself by disposing of special virtues and abilities, whereas in modern constitutions a democratic mandate is necessary. The concrete choice of exceptional models corresponds to specific constitutional cultures and historical experiences. Most often, the basic features of a constitution and the state structures, especially the separation of powers, is accentuated in the construction of emergency powers. For example, in the French system of the Fifth Republic, tailored to the ambitions of Charles de Gaulle, the elected president has a hegemonic position, so that it's no surprise that he is invested, or more precisely, he invests himself with special powers in the state of exception. Article 16 grants him very far-reaching competencies, where the institutions of the Republic, the independence of the nation, the integrity of its territory, or the fulfillment of its international commitments are under serious and immediate threat, and where the proper functioning of the constitutional public authorities is interrupted, the President of the Republic shall take measures required by these circumstances, after formally consulting the Prime Minister, the President of the House of Parliament, and the Constitutional Council. These measures spoken of are not specified in any way, and until the great constitutional reform of 2008, there was no factual control of the President's crisis action by the other branches, apart from the possibility of accusing the President of high treason. This is why Raymond Aron once denounced this Article 16 as legal coup d'etat. Since the 2008 reform, however, there are, after 30 days of the exercise of such emergency powers, several ways to appeal to the Constitutional Council, which must then decide if the conditions laid down in this paragraph still apply. This is an important remedy against the perpetuation of the state of emergency. Anyway, one should keep in mind that Article 16 has been only once applied so far during the Algerian War in 1961, but there are further provisions for the declaration of a state of exception. Article 36, which has never been applied in the Fifth Republic, entitles the Council of Ministers to declare a state of siege in reaction to exterior military attacks or interior armed insurrections, authorizing the military to assume police tasks and to curtail some basic rights. The state of siege can solely be extended by parliamentary approval after 12 days. And finally, in 1955 law, that is a law from the Algerian War preceding the Fifth Republic, provides the possibility to declare a state of exception, état d'urgence, by decree of the French president in the Council of Ministers, which gives special powers to the Minister of the Interior and the police, as you may see in this overview. The extension of the state of emergency after 12 days again necessitates a law passed regularly through Parliament. This law enables the declaration of the state of exception in the face of serious threats to public order or natural catastrophes. This law from 1955 has been resorted to twice during the Algerian War, 3 times in the context of decolonization in the 1980s, once during the banlieue riots in 2005, and most recently, as you all know, I think, after the terrorist attacks in 2015. I will speak about the symbolic constellations of those later. In sum, you can see that one legal order may provide different paths for the declaration of a state of exception, which differ as to their enabling power, the instruments of control, and their barriers against misuse of power. In Germany, Article 48 of the 1919 Weimar Constitution had, as is well known, some similarities to the French president's plein pouvoir in the original Article 16 just discussed. The Vice President was authorized to use any measures, including armed force and the suspension of many basic rights, that he deemed necessary to restore law and order when, I quote, public safety is seriously threatened or disturbed. As you all know, the Reichstag had the power to suspend these measures, but could be dissolved by the President. Hindenburg did this twice to avoid the suspension of emergency measures by Parliament. The most famous misuse of Article 48 was the Reichstag's Brandverordnung, Reichstag's fire decree by the Nazis, which Ernst Fraenkel, in his seminal study The Dual State, referred to as the Constitutional Charter, Verfassungsurkunde, of the Third Reich, as it enabled the Nazis to construct a dual legal state composed of some legal sections more or less intact, called the normative state, Normenstaat, whereas the prerogative state, Maßnahmenstaat, demonstrated the arbitrary and dictatorial suspension of legal rights and procedures. These traumatic experiences with far-reaching emergency powers made the founding fathers and mothers of the Grundgesetz in 1949 to renounce any constitutional provision for a state of exception. And the constitutional amendments in 1968, which provided for an emergency constitution, arranged for a strengthening of executive power while warranting parliamentary and judicial control at the same time with detailed procedural prescription, which are too voluminous to list them here, for the state of defense in case of an exterior military attack, for the state of tension, and for interior emergencies such as natural disasters or other catastrophes. I do not want to bore you with further examples because I think you can see that emergency provisions can either be detailed and restrictive or formulated in general clause-like vague terms, and the questions who is empowered and by which means can he or she be controlled are crucial. But I will continue with some general remarks that lead me into the direction of my main point of interest, to the perpetuations and expansions of states of exception. In France and Germany, there has been to different degrees a move towards stricter constitutional fencing of emergency powers, but a more striking fact is that constitutional provisions for emergency powers are often not or very rarely used, as many democracies try to deal with emergencies by what John Ferrejon and Pasquale Paschino have called the legislative model. In this model, which has not only been dominant in Great Britain after the decline of royal prerogative, but in many countries, a transfer of power toward the executive and the possibility of restricting basic rights is carried out by ordinary legislative means. The normative attractiveness of this model might be that it has high democratic legitimacy, whereas a pragmatic reason for proceeding this way certainly is that no open constitutional crisis is proclaimed, so that emergency powers often fly under the radar of constitutional alarm, as Kim Lane-Sheppeler has argued. When politicians try to avoid a thorough and critical public debate, a shift of power towards the executive by statute may be more promising than the open declaration of a state of exception, which has a different symbolic dimension to it. There are some further risks of this legislative model.
Excuse me, may I interrupt you? Can we open behind the door because of the sauna effect is so that it might have consequences for the way we do our discussions, and we can follow in another way, I think. Excuse me.
There are some further risks of this legislative model, as Ferejon and Pasquino have shown. If the legislature is willing to enact emergency law, this step might entail a lack of will to substantially monitor the executive. This depends, of course, on the type of governmental system, the rivalries between political factions and authorities and the like. A second risk, depending on the wording of the respective statute, is that delegation of power to the executive in exceptional times, which is thought to be temporary, leads to the permanent strengthening of the executive. This is one aspect which Agamben focuses on when he observes the, I quote, transformation of a provisional and exceptional measure into a technique of government. Thus, when Agamben speaks of the normalization of the state of exception, he has the gradual transformation of parliamentary democracy into the model of a governmental or executive democracy on a national level in mind. While this is a rather broad and general thesis, this has found some support in studies by French historian and theoretician of democracy Pierre Rosanvallon, which could, however, only be verified by thorough comparative analysis, of course. Finally, and related to the point just mentioned, another obvious risk of the legislative model is that temporary legislation becomes permanent, meaning that, I quote Ferejon and Pasquino, the laws made to deal with the emergency may become embedded in the normal legal system, essentially enacting permanent changes in that system under color of the emergency. Liberties won slowly over long periods of time may be subject to rapid erosion in emergencies, and these new restrictions, if they are embedded in law, may not be rapidly restored if they are restored at all. End of quote. In this case, the conservative nature of emergency legislation directed at the defense of the social and political order is lost. The fight against terrorism is the most prominent gateway for the structural extension of the state of emergency. In the 1970s, Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförde and many others have heavily criticized the German state for extensive legislation by which basic rights were curtailed in the context of the German Autumn and the terror of the Red Army faction, especially for being no temporary and clearly targeted and proportionate measures, but laws that were unlikely to be taken back in the future. And similar things can be observed since the attacks of 9/11. Great Britain, for example, has installed a particularly dense network of anti-terrorism acts in this millennium, while in the USA the infamous Patriot Act that was passed after 9/11 in order to allow the indefinite detention of suspects, intrusive forms of technical surveillance, the NSA system of data collection, and the like, was prolonged several times in only slightly modified terms until 2015. Then it was replaced by the so-called USA Freedom Act, so euphemistic labeling is very often involved in the complex of the state of exception, which was meant to impose some new limits on the bulk collection of telecommunication data by the intelligence agencies, but also endorsed a lot of provisions of the Patriot Act. And in France, the state of exception was first prolonged several times and finally replaced last year by a very controversial security law that gives the authorities many of the competences known from the état d'urgence. This extension and perpetuation of originally temporary and exceptional instruments is likely with regard to terrorism, as the impending scenario of terrorist attacks fosters a preventive orientation of law. Günther Frankenberg has argued that the paradigm of security has transformed parts of the penal and police laws in such a way that, I quote, "the state of exception has been normalized, the extraordinary has been reduced to a phenomenon of the everyday, and even the taboo of torture has been touched upon, also under cover of the rule of law." End of quote. A preventive in contrast to a retrospective orientation of penal or police law means that people are not judged for crimes they have committed in the past, but are assessed with regard to the likelihood that they commit a crime in the future. This is a very delicate complex because evidently in the case of terrorism the state cannot simply wait to convict criminals until some violent attacks have been launched. But the downside of a preventive orientation is that persons who are deemed dangerous are sometimes not only surveyed but also detained without having committed a crime. Just one example. Last summer the Bavarian Landtag passed a law that allowed the surveillance but above all the detention of suspects who cannot be charged with a specific crime, including the concrete intention of committing one, so-called Gefährder, dangerous persons, for a period of up to 3 months instead of 2 weeks as before. After 3 months, the law requires a judicial reassessment of each case. The duration of preventive custody without a verdict, however, is unlimited as long as a convenient judge can be found. By this kind of prevention, equality before the law is arguably suspended, and the involved partial loss of legal personality is articulated in new terms such as Gefährder, which is a political and police-related term, by the way, and not yet a legal one, or unlawful enemy combatant. That is how the Bush administration designated the inmates of Guantanamo with the aim to dispossess them of protection by the American Constitution or conventions of public international law. This strategy is in line with demands of a penal law of the enemy, Feinstrafrecht, which Günther Jacobs has described and later also endorsed in several articles and public statements, but I do not want to pursue this discussion here. The motivation behind all these reforms and conceptions is a double structure of penal law. The first layer Jacobs calls Bürgerrecht, applying to regular persons, citizens. The second one to dangerous persons or enemies. So Carl Schmitt's concept of the political re-entered the scene also in such terminological innovations. There are many further examples for the sometimes rule of law eroding logic of an expensive dispositive of security. Just a last point concerning this aspect, when Frankenberg, as you heard a moment ago, said that even the taboo of torture has been touched upon, he alludes to the German debate on Rettungsfolter, rescue torture, if one might translate this. Some years ago, when some legal scholars defended, albeit reluctantly, the exceptional right to torture in cases where a terrorist act could be presumably prevented by such action. This is the ticking time bomb scenario. It is well known that US intelligence services have tortured terrorists or dangerous persons in the aforementioned sentence as an alleged act of national security protection, labeled with the newspeak term enhanced interrogation techniques. So this euphemistic policy of denomination is unsettling, especially if you are aware that similar Nazi police practices were justified as verschärfte Vernehmung, intensified police questionings. So this side of prevention does not mean the exceptional restriction of some liberties, but it touches upon basic pillars of the legal system and, I would say, moral progress. Before discussing the symbolic side of the state of the exception, I would like to briefly address one recent example of the normalization of the state of exception, or rather of an exceptional style of politics or emergency politics and its effects, the handling of the financial crisis in the European Union. In 2015, Josef Vogel, one of the fiercest critics of the US politics in recent years, angrily commented on the striking measures by old and new crisis managers who were only weakly legitimated, criticizing an informalization of policymaking and fast-track decisions with long-lasting implications, all framed in narratives of exception and emergency. The at times breathtaking course of events and invention of crisis management have contributed to a mentality that accepted the recourse to the exception as the normal operating mode of the EU governance system. Florian Brödel spoke of a Notstandsmentalität, emergency mentality, that was procedurally condensed into an unwritten emergency constitution, according to him. By equating the preservation of the euro with the fate of the EU, the presumed inevitability of those measures was underlined by the main protagonists. Of course, I cannot discuss the whole course of action and all its implications here, but would like to highlight just some aspects instead. I will start with the legal constellation of the recent emergency politics. First of all, despite the dominant emergency narrative, there was no legal declaration of the state of emergency in the EU case, because the EU treaties do not provide for this option. Legally, the first contentious issue was whether the aid packages for Greece and later other states struck by the euro crisis, as well as the subsequent installation of the European Financial Stability Facility, were compatible with the provisions of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, TFEU, especially with the no bailout clause in Article 125, which prohibits any liability of EU member states for the debts of each other. The reason for this clause was to prevent the monetary union from becoming a transfer union, which is a dominant political question to this day. While leading politicians made it clear that the measures taken were without an alternative, they did not dare to justify them as an unlawful necessity or an open breach of law. Therefore, the heads of Eurostates tried to circumvent this obstacle by turning to the option of international law. It was no surprise that this national reserve of sovereignty was especially asserted in times of crisis in which a normal working mode of politics was obstructed. Nevertheless, this avoidance of EU law is somehow at odds with the process of European integration, one might say, particularly with the political will to cooperate at the EU level, as stated, for example, in the enhanced cooperation mechanism in the Treaty of Amsterdam. The institution of the European Financial Stability Facility, a joint stock company situated in Luxembourg, is an instrument entirely constituted by the conclusion of contracts between respective governments and is hence generated by private law. This solution was joined by the launch of the European Financial Stabilization Mechanism, EU funding program supervised by the Commission and to which all EU member states agreed. In 2012, the European Stability Mechanism was installed with the purpose of replacing these provisional devices. The ESM, constituted by an intergovernmental treaty between the Eurozone member states, is an intergovernmental organization operating under public international law. So you see how the structure works. That is more a construction of private law and intergovernmental rationalities than fitting into the supranational structure of the EU. Finally, this mechanism was harmonized with the Article 125 of the TFEU by amending Article 136, the third paragraph of which now reads: the member states whose currency is the euro may establish a stability mechanism to be activated if indispensable to safeguard the stability of the euro area as a whole. The granting of any required financial assistance under the mechanism will be made subject to strict conditionality. The legal validity of all these creative measures has been controversially discussed but was backed by many legal experts, in particular by several Supreme and Constitutional Courts, including the European Court of Justice. While some of the courts demanded adjustments concerning the procedural path of EU crisis politics, such as the German Constitutional Court, which requested a deeper involvement of the German Parliament in the ESM decision, it can hardly be denied that these courts are put under enormous pressure during proclaimed times of emergency. Christian Kreuder-Sonn has argued with regard to the controversial no bailout clause, I quote, "Present-day exceptionalism is more generally characterized by courts procedurally upholding the appearance of judicial checks on executive power, while substantially providing legal cover for emergency measures through sometimes far-fetched teleological interpretations of authority functions." End of quote. so deference can be one result of emergency situations. Even the acceptance of the legality of those emergency measures, however, could not deny the fact that the law of normal affairs has been changed by the facticity of crisis instruments. This holds true for the meaning of specific provisions such as Article 125, but applies to the character of the whole legal order. As Frank Schorkopf has convincingly argued, the circumvention of EU law, with its often protracted and politically complicated procedures, by means of international public law, which the heads of state turn to for pragmatic reasons, may ultimately put the entire idea of a supranational order as well as the image of the EU as a legal community into question. This might also be seen as a deviation from the project of integration through law, but it is of course a thesis we could discuss afterwards. But at least it should be clear that the partial suspension or circumvention of legal order usually does not leave the law of normal affairs untouched, but changes its content and validity. The empirical validity of laws depends largely on social expectations about the prospects of their application in the future. The open breach of law in the name of necessity or other overriding causes will likely alter those expectations decisively, just as audacious reinterpretations of existing laws will do. Moreover, the political implication of this handling of the crisis should not be overlooked. The often time-consuming legitimation by procedure, to quote Niklas Luhmann, was hollowed out and often trumped by short-sighted output legitimacy and a political style that has been termed intrusive, executive managerialism, or technocratic authoritarianism. The prominent role of the European Central Bank in the course of crisis management supported the impression of a technocratic and managerial shift of decision-making. This was especially visible when the ECB articulated its will to buy sovereign bonds issued by heavily indebted Eurozone member states in the framework of its outright monetary transaction program. While this eventually proved very effective in the short run, it had often been considered a transgression of the ECB's mandate. When Josef Vogel, however, polemically attacked the informality of powerful executive bodies that might be described as hastily convened committees of public safety, that was a quote, he alluded in particular to the so-called Troika composed of the EU Commission, ECB and the International Monetary Fund. This ad hoc institution was charged with the implementation of the austerity policy with which 8 recipient countries were confronted. The grants for these countries were conditioned on massive structural reforms and forced saving measures that were agreed upon in memoranda of understanding devised by the Troika. Not only was the procedure of the Troika's installation criticized from the start, but also its lack of accountability. While the Commission and the ECB were per se accountable to the European Parliament, the IMF was not exposed to such supervision, and neither was the body of the Troika in its entirety. This example also shows that factual emergency politics might indeed rely, in contrast to the usual constitutional regulations of the state of exception I spoke about above, on protagonists outside government, who have little or even no democratic legitimacy. The role of national parliaments in the course of the crisis has been judged differently. In Germany, the Federal Constitutional Court has in principle backed the emergency measures under condition of the substantial involvement of the German Bundestag, whereas in other countries the role of parliament was rather downplayed. Moreover, formal parliamentary involvement does not ensure that parliaments live up to their task as power-checking, representative and deliberative institutions. Practical constraints systematically prevent a critical assessment of the matter to be decided on, a situation that is fostered by Tina narrative, there is no alternative from the executive, as Jonathan White has observed. The downplaying of substantial parliamentary power might even be considered legitimate in situations where urgent emergency measures are demanded to restore the state of normal affairs. One of the structural dangers of emergency politics, however, is that it produces often groundbreaking and almost revolutionary measures with long-term consequences that are worthy of special critical scrutiny and discussion. but the framing of this type of politics as emergency or necessary frequently precludes the exact possibility of critical evaluation. In our example, rescue packages and stability mechanisms paralleled several decrees that were ultimately condensed into a comprehensive economic and fiscal policy imposed on the Eurozone states and other EU member states. By interfering with countries' sovereignty on fiscal and budgetary policy, these instruments access to a variety of policy areas that have so far been reserved for national politics, including tax, labor, and social policy. There are, of course, multiple legitimate standpoints as to the political and economic appropriateness of these instruments, but the style of these reforms has been regarded by many as kind of authoritarian. In sum, the structural effects show how a crisis and the nurturing of an emergency mentality can bring about results that cannot be achieved in regular times. So, in the last section of my talk, I will now address another aspect of the state of exception, namely its symbolic side, which has been widely neglected so far as I can see. When I speak of symbolic politics with regard to the state of exception, this signifies the deliberate and strategic use of images and performances, some aims and instruments of which I will show you in the remaining minutes. I start with the symbolic force of rhetoric. After the terrorist attacks in Paris in November 2015, which caused the deaths of 130 people, then President François Hollande declared a state of emergency, which was eventually prolonged in several steps until October 2017. Several days later, on November 16, Hollande addressed the Congress of the French Parliament in Versailles. The frame, style, and content of the speech constitute a highly useful example for the analysis of different dimensions and aims of the symbolic politics of the state of exception. First of all, the speech underlined that symbolic politics can involve factual political measures. No, that's right. Hollande announced the will to expatriate terrorists, provided with respect to international law that they are in possession of dual citizenship, even if they were born French citizens. Also, this project of expatriation failed due to a dissent between the National Assembly and the Senate. This attempt conveyed the desire to symbolically exclude terrorists and demonstrate that their acts were not compatible with the values of the French Republic. This announcement was accompanied by rhetoric that drew new boundaries of the French community, mainly by placing France as a brave country of freedom and the birthplace of human rights up against the cowardly, barbaric, and uncivilized terrorists. However, the political rhetoric, of which Hollande availed himself, also served other means than community building by accentuating the dichotomy of friend-enemy and civilization-barbarism. In the very first sentence of the same speech, Hollande declared France to be at war. There are a multitude of reasons to discuss if this framing of the aggression was appropriate, given the fact that it implicitly followed George W. Bush's infamous declaration of the war on terror. While Bush's rhetoric, which should not be reduced to manipulation, since it has often been read as the expression of a genuine Manichaean worldview, opposing good and evil, served to win support for the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Hollande's words were sometimes deemed misplaced, given the fact that most of the terrorists were from France or Belgium. Hollande's bellicose rhetoric, however, served a different purpose, namely trying to revamp his public image, which was notoriously weak after several scandals and an unlucky political agenda. The Guardian commented on his Versailles speech with the title, "Hollande completes transformation from marshmallow to chief of war," describing his personal reinvention from a feeble and indecisive politician whose aversion to conflict once earned him the nickname Marshmallow by fellow politicians of the Socialist Party to a fierce political and military leader. As the disastrous numbers in opinion polls at the end of his presidency have shown, this attempted reinvention did not sustainably succeed. Another prominent example of the symbolic force of rhetoric, again from France, stems from the 2005 riots in several Parisian suburbs, which ultimately led to the declaration of the state of emergency. Nicolas Sarkozy, who was Minister of the Interior at the time, used the riots to cultivate his image of a rigorous guarantor of law and order. Part of the strategy was to react to the exceptional instances of violence, whose genesis and history I cannot analyze here, with a fierce symbolic degradation of the population in the respective suburban quarters. Even before the riots, he spoke of a gang of scum, bande de racailles. He would get rid of, a formulation he repeated several times after the revolt had broken out. And his infamous announcement in another speech in La Courneuve, also before the riots, to cleanse the city by means of a Kercher, a high-pressure cleaner, was considered by many commentators as being close to fascism, even insinuating practices of ethnic cleansing. Moreover, with these words, Sarkozy triggered a larger political and societal debate which opposed the decent and civilized French citizens on the one side to the barbarian and subhuman creatures in certain quarters on the other side, revitalizing clichés from colonial times. And I would like to add that Sarkozy still tried to profit from this excessive rhetoric in the course of the electoral campaign for the presidency in 2017 in another way. Being confronted in an interview in June 2016 with the heavy criticism his words provoked during the 2005 riots, he tried to justify them by presenting himself as the spokesman of the real French people, who had totally understood his words, whereas only, I quote, the little world of Paris had been shocked. So this is a classically populist strategy of constructing a symbolic dichotomy of the authentic people on the one hand and a detached elite on the other. But I would like to come back briefly to the declaration of the state of emergency in 2005. It was heavily charged with a specific symbolic meaning. While every declaration of the state of exception is not only a speech act with political and legal consequences, but a symbolic act which suspends normality in a performative way, the 2005 declaration brought back memories of the Algerian War, leaning on a 1955 law I presented before, exactly from this period. This decision was obviously extremely delicate, considering a substantial number of rebels from the suburbs were likely to be the grandchildren of persons having witnessed the brutal disaster of this war. Hence, multiple layers of symbolic politics were involved in this intricate situation of exception. A lot more could be said about this concrete political conflict and the identity effects of the involved symbols and narratives, but I will rather focus now on selected images and sceneries different states of exception have been accompanied by. I already mentioned Hollande's speech at the Congress of the French Parliament in November 2015. And as you can see, this pompous venue certainly conveyed the gravity of the situation and gave Hollande's address a solemn character. Furthermore, the gathering at Versailles underlined the exceptionality of the situation, as the assembly of the Congress of Parliament is not a ritual demonstration of national unity, which is resorted to very often. On the contrary, it is assembled just on very rare occasions, usually when the constitution is amended. Hollande's speech marked only the second time that a French president seized the opportunity to address the Congress. Sarkozy was the first, a decision which had been made possible in the wake of the constitutional reform in 2008. Emmanuel Macron announced after his election to address the Congress once a year to explain his policy, but before this move, Versailles had been a symbol of exceptionality. To be sure, demonstrating national unity, identity and solidarity was no exceptional measure, but a very common strategy of communal self-assurance after a terrorist attack. As Charlotte Klonk has argued in her recent book on the battle of images inherent to terrorism and the reaction to it, the images distributed by the media usually follow the same logic. The display of disturbing pictures and sequences of the attacks is answered by the broadcast of surviving victims and the large-scale operation of the rescue service. Thus, images of paramedics taking care of those wounded in the Bataclan massacre and of the Eiffel Tower lit in France tricolor are in essence not different from pictures of flag-waving Americans, and especially the efforts of the firefighters at Ground Zero, even if the photos of the latter have become particularly iconic. In Paris, the image of the Eiffel Tower became a symbol of resilience. Illustrator Jean Julien created a popular image of the shape of the tower framed by a circle which resembled the iconic peace sign. And moreover, in addition to being illuminated in the national colors, the actual Eiffel Tower also displayed the phrase "Fluctuat nec mergitur," tossed by the waves but does not sink, Paris' motto as depicted in the city's coat of arms. This motto became a symbol of resistance and defiance in France in the days after the attacks, just as Americans rallied behind the slogan "United we stand" in 2001, which was first addressed to the American people in 1942 after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Furthermore, the collective memory of Pearl Harbor was revived when firefighters hoisted an American flag at Ground Zero, a scene that was redolent of an iconic picture taken by Joe Rosenthal on February 23, 1945, which depicted 3 US Marines doing the same action on the newly reconquered Pacific island Iwo Jima. Such flag hoisting on September 11 could not only be read as a sign of resilience and national pride, but also, at least by those familiar with the canonic visual heritage of the United States, as a symbol of military mobilization and retaliation that fit George W. Bush's subsequent rhetoric on the war on terror. Other images do not serve the purpose of creating a feeling of communality and solidarity, but are used to reinforce political leadership. Bush's emergency policy entailed the war on terror conducted abroad in Afghanistan and Iraq. Gerhard Paul is certainly right when he says that these wars were not waged entirely or perhaps even primarily for military reasons, but that they involved, I quote, operations of symbolic politics to override the images of America's defenseless and unprotected condition, to overcome the American trauma and to heal the hurt body of the nation, end of quote. I want to concentrate on a specific episode of this war. On 1st May 2003, Bush was flown to the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln to give a televised speech declaring mission accomplished, visually emphasized by a large banner decorated in his back. Actually, he never used these very words in his speech, once stating that the American mission had to continue, while also claiming that, I quote, "in the battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed," end of quote. In the aftermath of the speech, Bush and other officials claimed that the message "mission accomplished" had only been meant to refer to the concrete deployment of the aircraft carrier, which had just returned from a 10-month mission, or to the first step of the military intervention. The banner, however, clearly conveyed the message that the war in Iraq was over, an act of symbolic politics which backfired when insurgencies and civil wars spread in Iraq in the following years and the number of dead Americans increased as well. But at the time of his visit of the carrier, Bush's speech was rather well received in the USA, at least with certain parts of the population, helping him to design his image of a determined leader and the commander-in-chief. To this purpose, his performance on the carrier was carefully staged. He landed there with a jet instead of taking the usual helicopter, which would have been the much cheaper but also less theatrical way to get there. Bush's taking of a jet, accompanied by his wearing of a pilot uniform, had 2 advantages. Firstly, it contributed to the impression that the aircraft carrier still floated somewhere in the Persian Gulf and not, as it actually did, near the coast of California. And secondly, it fed the illusion that Bush had piloted the jet himself, given the fact that he had served as a jet pilot in the Air National Guard. Many spectators did not know, however, that Bush had not been trained to land on a carrier and mistook him for the pilot. All in all, these images were meant to show the deliberation of a president who did not limit himself to giving orders, but who led the way with his own military experience and courage in exceptional times. There are many other instances in which politicians try to present themselves as men of action in exceptional times. And this image might not be the most sublime picture in the history of political iconography, but it was very influential nevertheless. In August 2002, heavy rainfalls had culminated in an aggressive flood that devastated larger parts of Middle and Eastern Europe. In many German cities, an emergency alert was issued. The government, led by Chancellor Gerhard Schröder from the Social Democratic Party, initiated the largest domestic deployment of the army, Bundeswehr, since the Second World War, a means which had been made possible by the German Emergency Acts passed by the First Great Coalition in Germany in 1968. Schröder provided the affected communities and households with generous relief assistance and visually underlined his actions by repeatedly appearing in the flooded areas. Such visits can be regarded as important rituals that are meant to express compassion with the victims and demonstrate leadership capabilities by showing the urge to get first-hand information on the crisis at hand. Images of Schröder dressed in rubber boots and a slightly oversized green raincoat, marching through the flooded city of Grimma, climbing on dikes and talking to local politicians and citizens, found their way onto the news and front pages of many newspapers. While these mediatized performances were later often ironically commented on, the German weekly newspaper Die Zeit looked back on this episode 10 years later under the heading Der gestiefelte Kanzler. They proved very effective in 2002. Just a few weeks before the national election, they had Schröder overtake his contender Edmund Stoiber, who had been leading considerably in polls before the flood, and earn another term as Chancellor. Stoiber's loss, on the other hand, could partly be explained by the fact that he did not have incumbency advantage, which the confronting stage of Exception, if managed successfully, often produces, but also by his initial unwillingness to appear on the emergency scenes. When he finally interrupted his summer vacation and visited the affected regions himself, his public performance was still often considered unfitting and misplaced. Dressed in Armani jeans and a pale blue polo shirt, he seemed, despite his dialogue with the local citizens, detached from the emergency scene, especially in contrast to Schröder, whose outfit deliberately conveyed the message that aesthetic questions were not on the agenda. Perhaps even more memorable is the performance of one of Schröder's predecessors as Chancellor, Helmut Schmidt. In 1962, the city of Hamburg and other regions were struck by a storm surge, the destructive force of which caused the death of hundreds of people and further severe damage. Schmidt, Hamburg then young senator of the Interior, made a name for himself as an effective crisis manager who did not care about legal or even constitutional provisions by giving commands independent of the usual procedural path, hierarchies, and separation of powers. For example, the very important separation between the police and the military. Just as Schröder would later do, he sought help from the then newly established Bundeswehr, which was without constitutional backing at the time. Schmidt's pragmatic mastering of the situation earned him the reputation of being a reliable and resolute man of action, which later paved the way for the chancellorship. While this reputation can certainly be attributed to his effective orders, it was also fostered by the media coverage and his knowledge of how to play the media game, which had its share in cementing Schmidt's image as the master of realpolitik. Rather startling from a democratic point of view, regardless of Schmidt's merits, was the issue of Der Spiegel from that time, which conferred the lasting title of Herr der Flut to Schmidt, praising the former Wehrmacht officer's brisk militaristic rhetoric towards his inferiors and his decisions that were unconcerned with orderly procedure. And as you can see, the magazine even went as far as, without visible reservation, calling him a Führer who appointed himself. All these instances of visual politics I've mentioned so far should not, however, convey the impression that such images can always be produced at will, as they are often contested and sometimes can change their message in the course of time. The case of George W. Bush has already been discussed, and there are a lot more examples that support the thesis that the media strategy of US politics and the war on terror has often been misconceived. When the Pentagon published images from the alleged terrorists imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay, the reasoning behind that might have been to demonstrate resoluteness and superiority as part of a larger strategy of expressing the retrieval of sovereignty. The showing of the kneeling prisoners in orange orange overalls, however, rather provoked sympathy for the humiliated captives, regardless of their deeds, as Horst Bredekamp has argued. Thus, these pictures have become icons of the arbitrariness to which states of exception can easily succumb, and what is more, they have often unconsciously framed all discussions and opinions about the complex of Guantanamo afterwards. Hence, all American attempts to point to the ameliorated conditions of detention at Guantanamo Bay were overshadowed by the initially published images. Even more disastrous were the images from the Abu Ghraib prison, which have become public bit by bit since 2004 and which demonstrate the abyss of the politics of exception. I will not show them due to their atrocity, but all of you have certainly been confronted with these pictures showing prisoners tortured by the threat of electric shocks, being put on a leash like a dog, which is even more humiliating for Muslim inmates, as dogs are considered impure by Islam, or even images displaying prison guards posing happily beside the corpse of an inmate tortured to death. These pictures had to be interpreted as signs of a totally demoralized US Army and severely damaged the remnants of legitimacy of the Iraq War. The dehumanizing acts themselves could not be attributed to an individual misdemeanor, but were a result of the strategic instruction by the military and especially the Secret Service. Stealing every last bit of personal integrity from the inmates was meant to break their will and to gain useful information. But why did these guards document these atrocities by taking pictures? This documentation underlines the impression that the guards were totally disinhibited because they did not even try to hide their torturous deeds, suggesting, as Wolfgang Bergam has seen, the routine and presumed normalcy of their acts. Furthermore, the images could be the product of the contemporary selfie culture that takes only that for real which has been documented by picture. And finally, Horst Bredekamp takes them as an apotropaic protection against the unseizability of the enemy, a cultural technique known from the Second World War, when German soldiers carried a large amount of pictures showing the execution of guerrilla fighters in their pockets. In any case, these images have become iconic of the state of exception and its danger of ultimately leading to the production of bare life, in Agamben's words, detached from all legal rules and the most basic moral and human conventions. Thank you.